Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. When I was young, I remember watching a documentary that I probably was not old enough to fully understand at the time, but it stayed with me in a way that very few things ever have. It was late evening, and the TV was just playing something in the background while I was sitting with family. I wasn't really expecting anything serious. Back then, documentaries were just something you randomly ended up watching when you were flipping through channels, not something you intentionally searched for. But this one caught my attention quickly, and once it did, I couldn't really look away. It started by introducing a man who had gone through something extremely rare and life-changing. The tone of the documentary was calm, almost clinical at first, as if it was trying to gently explain something very difficult without overwhelming the viewer. It talked about how he had contracted a severe bacterial infection that affected his face in a very aggressive and destructive way. I didn't fully understand the medical details at the time, but I could tell from the way the narration was worded that this was something serious and unusual. As the story went on, it explained that the infection had started in a small way, almost like something that could have been ignored or treated early if things had gone differently. But instead, it spread in a way that doctors struggled to control. It reached his nasal area and surrounding facial structure, and over time it caused damage that was both medically and emotionally devastating for him. What struck me, even as a kid, wasn't just the medical explanation itself, but the way the documentary showed the human side of it. This wasn't just about a condition or a rare case. It was about a person whose life had been completely changed in a very short period of time, and how he had to adapt to a reality that most people could never imagine. I remember sitting there quietly, not really asking questions, just watching. The documentary explained how doctors fought to stop the infection and save his life. That part was very clear. Their priority was survival first, and everything else came after that. The infection had caused such severe damage that removing the affected tissue was the only way to prevent it from spreading further. It was not a simple or quick process. It involved multiple procedures, careful decisions, and a long recovery period that would continue for years. At some point, the narration shifted from medical explanation to what life became for him afterward. That's when it started to feel more real and harder to process. They explained that after the infection had been controlled, he was left with significant facial damage. His appearance had changed completely. He had lost most of what people normally associate with facial structure. And because of that, doctors eventually fitted him with a prosthetic face. The way they described it was very careful, almost trying not to sound harsh, but there was no way to soften what had happened. It was a replacement designed to help him appear more normal in daily life, but it was still artificial, something that had to be worn rather than something that was part of him. Back then, prosthetic technology was not what it is today. And the documentary made it clear that it was not perfect or highly advanced. It was more like a mask, shaped to resemble human features as closely as possible, but still noticeably artificial if you look closely. It served a purpose, but it wasn't something that could fully restore what had been lost. What I remember most clearly is how they showed his life after everything. He spoke about how he adjusted to living with it. There was a quiet strength in his voice, the kind that comes from having gone through something that permanently changes your perspective on everything. He talked about learning how to go out in public again, how to interact with people, and how to rebuild a sense of normal life even when everything about your appearance has changed. Even as a child watching it, I could sense that this was not just a medical story. It was about identity, confidence, and how someone continues living when something so fundamental about them has been altered. As the documentary moved toward its final moments, the tone became more personal. It wasn't just about doctors or procedures anymore. It was about him, his day-to-day reality, and how he had come to accept a life that was very different from the one he had before. I remember feeling a mix of confusion and discomfort at that age, not because I fully understood the severity of what had happened, but because I could sense how serious it was and how deeply it affected him as a person. There was something unsettling about realizing that life could change so drastically due to something invisible and biological, something you cannot see or predict when it first begins. Then came the moment that I still remember most clearly, even all these years later. Near the end of the documentary, he removed his prosthetic face. It wasn't presented in a dramatic way, at least not in the way films or shows usually build suspense. It was quiet. He simply took it off in front of the camera, as if it was part of his normal routine. But for the viewer, it was anything but normal. What was revealed underneath was the result of everything he had gone through. There was no attempt to exaggerate it or make it sensational. It was shown in a straightforward, honest way. His facial structure had been severely affected by the illness and the surgeries that followed. What remained was not something the camera tried to focus on in detail, but it was enough to understand the extent of what had happened. I remember my reaction more than I remember the exact image. It wasn't fear exactly, and it wasn't shock in the way horror movies create shock. It was something quieter and heavier, a kind of disbelief mixed with a sudden awareness of how fragile the human body actually is. It was one of those rare moments where you realize, even as a child, that the world contains things far beyond what you are used to seeing in everyday life. After that moment, the documentary didn't try to dwell on it. It didn't linger or try to sensationalize his appearance. Instead, it moved back to him as a person, focusing on how he continued living, how he interacted with others, and how he managed the emotional and social challenges that came with his condition. He talked about acceptance, not in an overly inspirational way, but in a very grounded, realistic sense. It wasn't about pretending everything was fine. It was about learning how to function in a world that now saw him differently, and how he had to find a way to live with that reality every single day. When the documentary ended, I remember sitting quietly for a while. I didn't really know what to say or how to process what I had just seen. As a child, you are used to stories having clear endings, where everything makes sense or returns to normal in some way. But this didn't feel like that. There was no return to how things used to be. There was only life continuing forward in a completely changed form. Even now, many years later, I still think about that documentary from time to time. Not in a disturbing way, but in a reflective one. It made a quiet but lasting impression on how I see health, accidents, and the human body in general. It also made me understand, in a way that stuck with me, that there are conditions and experiences people go through that most of us will never fully comprehend, unless we are directly exposed to them. What stays with me the most is not just the medical story itself, but the person at the center of it. Someone who went through something life-altering, survived it, and still chose to appear in a documentary to share his experience with others. That kind of openness takes a level of strength that is difficult to fully appreciate at any age, let alone when you are still young and just beginning to understand the world. Looking back now, I realize that moment shaped the way I think about stories like this. It taught me that behind every unusual medical case or rare condition, there is always a real person who has had to adjust to a completely different life. Not just physically, but emotionally and socially as well. And even though the memory of that final scene is still vivid, what I remember most clearly is not the visual detail, but the feeling it left behind. A quiet reminder that life can change in ways you never expect, and that people can endure far more than you would ever assume just by looking at them. My mom used to tell me a story from her college days in the late 70s, and even though she always shared it in a calm, almost casual tone, it never really felt like something casual to me. The way she spoke about it made it sound like just another memory from her youth. But the more I thought about it over the years, the more it felt like something heavier had been quietly sitting underneath it the whole time. It all began during her very first semester at university. Everything was still new to her back then. The kind of new where even simple things like finding classrooms or talking to strangers felt slightly overwhelming. She was taking chemistry, and for one of her lab sessions, she was paired with a boy she didn't know before. She remembered noticing him right away because he seemed friendly and easy to talk to. In her own words, she thought he was kind of cute. But she was also very shy at the time, the kind of shy that makes you overthink even the smallest interaction. They started working together in the lab like most students do, sharing equipment, comparing notes, and figuring out experiments side by side. It was nothing dramatic or special on the surface, just the normal rhythm of two students being forced into the same space and slowly getting comfortable around each other. My mom later admitted that if he had ever asked her out in those early days, she probably would have said yes, but he never did. And she never had the confidence to take that step herself. So things stayed exactly where they were. Polite, friendly, and contained within the walls of that lab room. Outside of chemistry class, their lives didn't really overlap. They were in different majors, had different timetables, and moved through different parts of campus. My mom would go from class to class, trying to adjust to university life, and he would do the same on his side. So whatever small connection existed between them stayed limited to those lab hours, nothing more. At first, there was no reason to think anything was unusual. Everything seemed normal, like the beginning of any quiet college friendship. But slowly, over the weeks that followed, my mom started noticing small things that didn't immediately feel alarming, but also didn't quite make sense when she thought about them later. It began with occasional sightings. She would sometimes see him outside her other classes, just standing or passing by as if it were completely natural for him to be there. At first, she didn't think much of it. Universities are big places, and running into people is normal. But then it happened again, and again. It wasn't just random anymore. It started to feel like he was showing up in places he had no obvious reason to be. She would see him near the library when she went there to study. Then she noticed him around the student union, even when she wasn't expecting anyone familiar. Once or twice, she thought it might just be coincidence, but the pattern kept repeating. Eventually, she even saw him outside the building where her father used to drop her off and pick her up. That was the moment where something inside her quietly shifted, even if she didn't fully admit it to herself yet. It wasn't fear at first. It was confusion. She couldn't understand how someone could consistently appear in the same places she happened to be, especially when they didn't share classes or schedules. It didn't make sense in a normal, everyday way. And because she was still young and inexperienced, she tried to rationalize it instead of immediately labeling it as something wrong. But the feeling of discomfort kept growing in the background. After a while, she decided she needed to ask him directly. One day, she gathered her courage and asked him how he always seemed to know where she would be. She didn't accuse him of anything. She just wanted an explanation, something that would make it all feel less strange in her mind. His answer came quickly, and it wasn't hesitant or embarrassed. In fact, he seemed almost proud when he said it. He told her that he had gone to the registrar's office and requested a copy of her class schedule. My mom always pauses when she tells this part of the story. She says that was the moment something in her understanding changed completely. Before that, she could still convince herself it was coincidence or harmless timing. But hearing that made it clear that it wasn't accidental at all. It was intentional. He had actively taken steps to find out where she would be, without ever asking her if that was okay, or considering how it might feel on the other side. Even though she didn't fully have the language for it back then, she understood enough to feel uncomfortable. It crossed a line that she instinctively recognized, even if the people around her didn't seem to treat it that way. Feeling uneasy and unsure of what to do, she went to the secretary's office and explained what had happened. She thought someone would understand her concern, or at least acknowledge that it felt wrong, but the response she received was the opposite of what she expected. Instead of concern, she was brushed off. The situation was treated lightly, almost casually. She was told something along the lines of, "They must be dating," as if that explanation made everything acceptable. As if the idea of a relationship erased the need for boundaries or consent around personal information. That reaction left her feeling even more isolated. It wasn't just the boy's behavior anymore. It was also the sense that the people she turned to for help didn't see it as something serious. That made it harder for her to know how to respond or whether she was overreacting. As the semester continued, she tried her best to manage the situation on her own. She avoided him as much as she could without drawing attention to it. She changed her routine slightly, stayed in groups when possible, and focused on her studies. She didn't confront him again, and she didn't escalate it further, partly because she didn't feel supported enough to do so. Luckily, she already had plans to transfer to a different university for her second year. That decision ended up becoming an important escape point for her, even though she didn't think of it that way at the time. Once she moved schools, she slowly stopped encountering him, and eventually he faded out of her day-to-day life completely. For a while, it felt like that chapter had finally closed. She moved on, continued her studies, and built a new routine in a different environment. It was something she rarely talked about afterward, as if it belonged to a version of her life that no longer existed. But the story didn't end there, even though it seemed like it had. Years later, when she was in graduate school and already working, something unexpected happened that brought the memory back in a very strange and unsettling way. One day, my mom was at work when someone came to my grandmother's house and knocked on the door. My grandmother opened it and found a man standing there in a naval uniform. That detail mattered, because my grandmother had once worked as a Navy nurse, so seeing someone in uniform immediately created a sense of familiarity and trust. The man also didn't come across as threatening at first. He looked emotional, even distressed, like someone carrying heavy news. Because of his appearance and the way he spoke, my grandmother let him inside without much hesitation. He began by offering condolences. He said he was sorry for my mother's loss. That immediately confused my grandmother because she had no idea what he was talking about. She asked him to explain, and he said that he had just returned from overseas deployment and had recently learned that his close friend had taken his own life. He went on to say that his friend had often spoken about my mom and referred to her as his fiancée. He said he had come to meet her in person and expressed sympathy, believing she had been engaged to someone he cared about. At that point, my grandmother stopped him immediately. She told him very clearly that her daughter did not have a boyfriend, let alone a fiancé. There had been no engagement, no relationship, nothing that matched what he was describing. That was when everything started to fall into place in a very disturbing way. The man he was talking about was the same boy from my mom's college days, the lab partner, the one who had once seemed friendly but gradually became someone who crossed boundaries in ways she only fully understood later. The same person who had appeared unexpectedly around her life years before. The naval officer who had come to the door turned out to be a friend of his, and once he realized the truth, his reaction reportedly shifted from polite sadness to visible discomfort and shock. My grandmother, on the other hand, became deeply alarmed. She made sure the conversation ended quickly and that he left before my mom returned home, not wanting to reopen something she had already moved past. What made the entire story even more unsettling was what was later mentioned about the circumstances of the man's death. It was officially recorded as a suicide, but some of the details surrounding it never fully made sense to people who heard them. He was reportedly found hanging from a very high tree branch, one that would normally be difficult to reach without equipment like a ladder. There were also claims that his hands had been tied behind his back, which only added more confusion and speculation around the situation. On top of that, there were vague mentions that he had a history of creating conflict and trouble in different situations, not just related to my mom. Because of all these inconsistencies, people around the story never really reached a clear conclusion about what actually happened. It remained surrounded by unanswered questions. My mom, however, never focused on those details. When she tells the story now, she does it in a calm and matter-of-fact way, as if it belongs to a distant chapter that no longer affects her life. She often says that back then, people didn't understand stalking or personal boundaries in the way they do now, and that awareness has changed a lot since those years. But for me, hearing it has always left a different impression. What stays in my mind isn't just the later part of the story, but how ordinary everything looked at the beginning. A lab partnership, friendly conversations, a normal college routine. Nothing that would immediately raise concern. And yet, over time, it slowly turned into something that followed her beyond the classroom and touched her life in unexpected ways. The part that lingers most is how easily it could have gone further if even one detail had been different. If she hadn't changed schools. If the behavior had been ignored for longer. If there had been more support or understanding earlier on. My mom tells it like it's just something that happened long ago. A strange memory from a different time. But when I think about it, it feels like a reminder of how quietly things can shift. How something that starts small and almost invisible can become something much harder to ignore if it's not recognized in time. And even though it all ended years ago, it's the kind of story that doesn't really leave you, not because of how it ended, but because of how quietly it began. I was in the drunk tank with a guy who had beaten another man to death. The victim didn't die right away. He was taken to intensive care and stayed alive for about 3 days before finally passing away in the hospital. The man I was locked up with told me details about what had happened, very casually, like he was talking about something that didn't fully belong to him anymore. I was 17 at the time, and I still remember how unreal it felt sitting there listening to someone like that, knowing I couldn't just get up and leave. At that age, I didn't really understand how quickly life could put you in situations you were completely unprepared for. One moment, you're just a teenager making mistakes, and the next, you're sitting in a holding cell next to someone whose actions had already destroyed a life. I remember the drunk tank itself being cold in a way that stayed in your bones. The air felt heavy, like it had been reused too many times. Everything smelled faintly of sweat, metal, and disinfectant that didn't really clean anything properly. There were a few of us in there, but the one I remember most clearly was him. He wasn't acting like someone who had just done something extreme. That was the part that made it worse. He was calm, almost relaxed in a way that didn't match what he was talking about. At first, I didn't even know the full story. People in those situations don't always introduce themselves with the truth. It comes out slowly, in pieces, like you're forced to listen whether you want to or not. Over time, he started talking about what had happened earlier that night. Not in a dramatic way, not like a confession you see in movies, but more like he was explaining a situation that had spiraled out of control. He described how things had escalated, how quickly everything had gone from an argument to something irreversible. He didn't go into every detail, but what he did say was enough for me to understand the seriousness of it. I remember sitting there pretending to listen, less than I actually was, trying to keep my face neutral. Inside, I felt completely out of place. I was 17, still figuring out who I was supposed to be, and suddenly I was sharing space with someone whose life had already taken a turn that couldn't be undone. It didn't feel real. It felt like I had been dropped into someone else's nightmare and told to wait it out quietly. The worst part wasn't just what he said. It was how normal he sounded while saying it. There was no shaking in his voice, no hesitation that suggested regret in the moment. He spoke like it was just another night that had gone wrong. I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't have the maturity or experience to process it properly. So I just sat there, hoping the conversation would move on to something else. But it didn't really move on. It just lingered in the room like a weight. The drunk tank itself wasn't a place where you felt time properly. There was no comfort, no privacy, nothing to break the hours into anything meaningful. You just existed there, waiting for whatever came next. I remember trying to focus on small things instead of what he was saying. The sound of footsteps in the hallway, the way the fluorescent light buzzed slightly overhead, the distant noise of doors opening and closing somewhere deeper in the building. Sleep was the hardest part. You're supposed to lie down and rest, but how do you sleep when you're inches away from someone who has already been involved in something like that? I remember lying there with my back turned slightly, pretending to be calmer than I actually was, while my mind stayed fully awake. Every small sound felt amplified. Every movement from his side of the cell made me more aware of how close we actually were. I kept telling myself that I was probably overthinking it, that people end up in those situations for all kinds of reasons, and maybe I was misunderstanding the situation. But then he would talk again, quietly, as if continuing his own thoughts out loud, and it would pull me right back into the reality of it. He spoke about the man who had been hurt like it was already something in the past. even though the situation was still technically unfolding in real time. At that point, the victim was still alive in intensive care. I didn't fully understand then how strange that was, how something could already feel concluded for one person while still being unresolved for everyone else. The days blurred together in a strange way. There wasn't much to do except wait. You don't really get a sense of structure in a drunk tank. You just get moments of silence broken by conversation you don't want and thoughts you can't escape. I started noticing small things just to keep my mind busy. The way other people in the cell shifted around. The sounds from outside the door. The occasional shouting down the hallway that made everyone go quiet for a few seconds. What stayed with me most wasn't just what he said, but the tension of being stuck there with no control over my situation. I was 17, technically still a minor, and I kept thinking about how strange it was that this was where I ended up. I wasn't part of anything that serious, at least not in my mind. I was just there because of poor choices and bad timing. But that didn't matter in that moment. Once you're inside that space, everyone is treated like part of the same system, regardless of how different the reasons are. On the third day, something changed. I didn't understand it fully at first. The officers came in, opened the cell, and their tone was different, more serious, more direct. They called his name and told him to gather his things. There wasn't much he had with him, but he stood up immediately. I remember watching him closely. He trying to read what was happening from his expression. He didn't seem surprised. If anything, it felt like he had been expecting it. They took him out of the cell and moved him into isolation across the hall. It happened quickly, without much explanation to the rest of us. At that point, I didn't know why it was happening. I just remember the shift in energy once he was gone. The cell felt different immediately, like something heavy had been removed from the space, but the weight of it still lingered behind. Later, I found out that the man he had hurt had died in the hospital that same day. That detail stayed with me in a strange way because it made everything feel more final. While we were sitting there in that cell, life outside was still moving forward in a way that directly changed what would happen to him next. He wasn't just someone in custody anymore. The situation had escalated legally into something much more serious. After that, the correctional officers didn't bring him back to general population. He stayed isolated across the hall until the official charge was upgraded to capital murder. Only then was he fully removed from our cell environment. I remember thinking about how strange that timing was, how everything depended on official classifications and paperwork, even when something so serious had already happened. At 17, I didn't have the language to fully understand what I was feeling. It was a mix of fear, confusion, and a strange kind of disbelief. I wasn't in danger in the direct sense, but being that close to someone capable of that kind of violence changed how I saw the space I was in. It made everything feel less predictable, like the normal rules of safety didn't fully apply anymore. The memory that stays with me the most isn't even one specific moment. It's the feeling of lying there at night, trying to convince myself to sleep while knowing exactly who was just a few feet away from me. There's a certain kind of fear that doesn't come from immediate danger, but from awareness, from understanding that you are sharing space with something you don't fully comprehend and can't control. I remember wondering if anyone outside really thought about situations like that. If people understood what it felt like to be placed so close to something so heavy, without warning or preparation. At that age, you don't really question systems or procedures. You just experience them and try to survive them quietly. Even now, years later, what stands out most is how normal everything looked on the surface. A cell, A few people sitting around, guards coming and going. But underneath that normal structure was a reality that felt completely different depending on who you were sitting next to. When I think back on it, I don't focus on the crime itself as much as I focus on the environment around it. The waiting, the uncertainty, the way information trickled in slowly, changing the meaning of everything after the fact. And most of all, I think about how young I was sitting in that space, trying to make sense of something I was never prepared to understand. It's one of those experiences that doesn't really fade, not because of what was said directly, but because of how it made me feel in the moment. Small, exposed, and completely out of control of where I was or what was happening around me. When I was working in healthcare, I once came across a patient whose case stayed in my memory for a long time. Not because it was unusual at the start, but because of how quickly things changed from something that looked simple into something extremely serious. He first came in with what seemed like a basic sinus infection. There was nothing about his condition that raised any immediate concern. His symptoms were very typical of what we see often in clinical settings. He had facial pressure, discomfort around the nose and eyes, and general signs that matched a common infection. In the beginning, it really looked like a straightforward case that would not cause any complications. After a proper assessment, he was diagnosed and started on a standard course of antibiotics. Everything about the plan was routine. There was no reason to expect anything unusual. These kinds of infections are usually very manageable, and most patients start feeling better within a short time if they follow the treatment properly. For the first few days, his progress looked good. He responded to the medication the way we expected. His symptoms started to reduce, and he began to feel relief from the pressure and discomfort. From a medical point of view, everything suggested that the treatment was working exactly as it should. There was no sign that the infection was spreading or getting worse. After a short period, he returned and reported that he felt much better. He said the pain had gone down significantly, and the pressure in his face had almost disappeared. From his perspective, it felt like the problem was basically over. This is a moment we often see in healthcare, where patients start to feel normal again and believe that the illness has fully gone away. Because he was feeling better, he made a decision that unfortunately happens quite often. He stopped taking his antibiotics before completing the full course. At that time, it probably seemed harmless to him. When symptoms disappear, many people assume that the infection has also completely left the body. It is a very common misunderstanding, especially with infections that improve quickly at first. For a little while after that, everything appeared stable. There were no immediate warning signs, no sudden return of symptoms, and nothing that suggested a problem was developing. From the outside, it would have looked like he had recovered completely. But then, unexpectedly, he came back to the emergency department, and this time the situation was completely different. He was no longer presenting with simple sinus discomfort. Instead, he arrived with serious neurological symptoms. His condition resembled something like a stroke, which immediately raised alarm among the medical staff. This was a major shift from his earlier condition, and the change had happened in a very short period of time. It was no longer a routine infection case. Something much more serious was happening inside his body. The medical team acted quickly and began urgent investigations. He underwent scans and neurological evaluations without delay. As the results started coming in, the situation became clearer and also much more concerning. The infection had not stayed limited to the sinus area. Instead, it had progressed beyond its original location and moved upward into the cranial region. At that point, the case had completely changed in nature. It was no longer a simple infection that could be treated with standard medication. It had become a critical condition involving the area close to the brain. This kind of progression is rare, but when it happens, it becomes extremely serious very quickly. The imaging results confirmed the severity of the situation. There was clear evidence that the infection had spread significantly. Along with that, there was swelling and pressure effects that were beginning to interfere with normal neurological function. This explained the symptoms he was showing when he arrived. The atmosphere in the department changed immediately after the scans were reviewed. What had started as a common and manageable case had now become a medical emergency. Everyone involved understood that this situation required fast and aggressive intervention. There was no room for delay or conservative treatment at this stage. The surgical team was called in right away. After reviewing the imaging and assessing the patient's condition, they determined that surgery was necessary. The case was complex and high risk. There was a real concern about the outcome because of how close the infection was to critical brain structures. The seriousness of the situation was explained to his family. They were told that the surgery carried significant risk and that the outcome was uncertain. These are always very difficult conversations because they involve explaining that even with the best possible treatment, survival is not guaranteed. The family had to process a situation that had escalated very quickly from something simple to something life-threatening. Despite the risks, surgery was the only option. Without it, the infection would continue to spread, and the pressure on the brain would increase further. The goal of the operation was to remove as much of the infection as possible and relieve the dangerous pressure that was affecting his neurological condition. When the surgery began, the medical team quickly realized that the situation was even more severe than what the scans had suggested. The infection had spread extensively, and there was a significant buildup of infected material in areas that required extremely careful handling. The surgical field was very delicate, and even a small mistake could have serious consequences because of the nearby brain structures. The team worked with extreme care and focus. Every step had to be done slowly and precisely. The main priority was to remove infected tissue while also protecting the surrounding areas from damage. It was not a simple procedure. It required constant attention, coordination, and careful decision-making throughout the operation. The surgery took a long time, and it was physically and mentally demanding for everyone involved. Situations like this are always tense because the outcome is uncertain until the very end. There are moments where progress is being made, but also constant awareness that complications can appear at any time. After a long and difficult procedure, the medical team managed to complete the operation successfully, i.e., against the initial expectations, the patient survived the surgery. This was a major relief, but everyone also understood that the journey was far from over. Recovery in cases like this is rarely quick or straightforward. Even though the immediate danger had been addressed, the infection had already caused enough damage that further treatment was needed. Over time, he required additional surgeries to manage remaining infection and complications that continued to appear during recovery. In total, he went through 3 more surgical procedures after the first one. Each surgery had a specific purpose, whether it was removing remaining infected tissue, reducing complications, or helping stabilize his condition as his body slowly healed. It was a long process that required patience and continuous monitoring. His hospital stay extended for almost 2 months. During this time, his condition went through several phases. There were moments where things improved and gave hope that he was finally recovering in a steady way. But there were also setbacks that reminded everyone how serious the original condition had been. The recovery process was slow and required constant care. He was closely monitored by the medical team throughout his stay. Every small change in his condition mattered, and adjustments were made in treatment depending on how his body responded. It was a long period of uncertainty for both the medical staff and his family. Gradually, over time, his condition began to improve in a more stable way. His body started responding better to treatment, and the signs of infection slowly reduced. Step by step, he moved closer to recovery. It was not a quick turnaround, but a steady and careful improvement. Eventually, after a long hospital stay and multiple procedures, he reached a point where he was stable enough to be discharged. He had survived an illness that had reached a very critical stage and carried a real risk of becoming fatal. His recovery was a result of both medical intervention and his own resilience over a long and difficult period. Cases like this often remain in your memory for a long time when you work in healthcare. Not because they happen every day, but because they show how quickly a situation can change. Something that starts as a simple and common infection can turn into a life-threatening condition if it is not fully treated. It also becomes a strong reminder of how important it is for patients to complete their full course of medication. Feeling better does not always mean that the infection is completely gone. Sometimes symptoms improve on the surface while the infection is still present inside the body. If treatment is stopped too early, there is always a risk that the infection can return in a much more serious and dangerous form. In this case, that lesson became very real. What began as a routine infection turned into a long and complex medical journey that required multiple surgeries, extended hospitalization, and a great deal of effort from the medical team. In the end, the patient survived, but the experience highlighted how fragile recovery can be when treatment is not completed properly. I once met a guy who told me a story from when he was traveling around Australia with a couple of friends. They were backpacking and hitchhiking their way through different towns, picking up rides when they could and staying wherever they were offered a place. It was the kind of loose, free travel that a lot of young people do when they're trying to see the world on very little money, living day to day and not really planning too far ahead. Most of the time, they stayed in cheap hostels or camped somewhere outside town. But every now and then, they got lucky and ended up staying with locals who offered them a place to sleep. In remote parts of Australia, especially out in the rural areas, it is not unheard of for people to be generous like that, particularly when they see young travelers with backpacks and no real plan for the night. One day, while they were somewhere in the middle of their route, one of his friends mentioned something interesting. They had just passed through a region that was apparently not too far from a distant uncle's property. It wasn't someone he had ever met before in his life. In fact, he barely even knew the name properly, only that the man was related somehow through extended family connections that had never really been part of his life. Still, out of curiosity and convenience, one of the group managed to get a phone number from a family member back home. It was a bit of a long shot, but they thought it might be worth trying. They were tired, low on money, and the idea of having a proper place to stay for a couple of nights sounded better than sleeping outdoors again. When they called, the uncle on the other end turned out to be surprisingly welcoming. He didn't hesitate much. He told them they could come out and stay at his place for a bit. For young travelers in that situation, that kind of offer felt like a stroke of luck. It meant a break from uncertainty, a roof over their heads, and a chance to rest properly. He arranged to pick them up from town. They remember waiting at a small, quiet spot, the kind of place where buses pass infrequently and there is not much around except open roads and long stretches of dry landscape. When he arrived, he seemed friendly enough. There was nothing immediately unusual about him. He greeted them warmly, asked a few basic questions about their trip, and treated them like guests rather than strangers. The drive out to his property took a while. As they left the town behind, the surroundings slowly changed. Buildings became fewer, roads became emptier, and eventually the landscape turned into wide, open bushland. It was the kind of isolated rural area where properties are far apart, and you can drive for a long time without seeing another house. The further they went, the quieter everything felt. When they finally arrived at his place, it was a fairly simple rural home, nothing extravagant or particularly memorable. It looked lived in, ordinary, and consistent with someone who had been living there alone for a long time. The uncle still came across as relaxed and cheerful. He spoke casually, showing them around and making them feel comfortable. There was no sense of tension or anything that would make them uneasy at that point. As evening approached and they started thinking about where they would sleep, the uncle told them to follow him. He took them to a closet inside the house. At first that seemed a little strange, but nothing about the situation felt threatening. When he opened the door, they saw that it was completely full of sleeping bags and rolled-up bed mats. It looked like he had stored camping gear for guests or travelers who might pass through. They didn't question it much. In fact, it made a certain kind of sense. Out in remote areas like that, having extra sleeping gear around wasn't unusual, so each of them picked up a sleeping bag, grabbed a space in the living room, and set themselves up on the floor. It was simple, but after days of travel, it was enough. They were just glad to have a roof over their heads and a place to rest, without worrying about the weather or safety outside. The first night passed without anything unusual. The house was quiet. The uncle went about his own routine, and they mostly kept to themselves. There was nothing in his behavior that stood out as strange. He continued to seem friendly, even a bit cheerful in a quiet, rural way. For travelers like them, it felt like just another lucky stop on their journey. They ended up staying a couple of days. During that time, nothing happened that would have raised any alarm. They ate, rested, and spent time planning their next move. The uncle remained polite and accommodating. If anything, he seemed like an ordinary rural resident who was simply doing a kind gesture for a group of young travelers passing through. Eventually, it was time for them to leave. The uncle offered to drive them back to town, which they accepted. It felt like a normal goodbye. There were no signs of anything unusual, no awkwardness, no reason to feel uncomfortable. He dropped them off at the bus station, and from there, they continued on with their travels as planned. Life moved on after that, as it does when you're on the road. New places, new people, different experiences. The memory of that stop likely became just another story in a long list of travel memories, something you recall later without attaching much importance to it at the time. But everything changed about a year later. Sometime after that encounter, news began to spread about a man who had been arrested in connection with the multiple murders. The details that came out were disturbing. He had been targeting young hitchhikers and backpackers, people traveling through remote areas who would have little protection and little connection to local support systems. He would pick them up, gain their trust, and then commit violent crimes against them. When the full story became public, it shocked a lot of people, especially those who had traveled through similar routes. The idea that someone could appear completely normal, even friendly, while hiding something so dark was deeply unsettling. For the man who told me this story, the realization came later and hit even harder. As more details about the case were released, including locations and patterns, he slowly began to piece things together. And eventually, it became clear to him that the property he had stayed at belonged to the same man who had been arrested. What made it even more disturbing was something he said he couldn't easily forget. During their stay, they had used sleeping bags from that closet. After the arrest, it was confirmed that the man had been using his home as part of his crimes, and there was evidence linking victims to the same kinds of items and spaces they had casually used without thinking twice. That led him to a chilling conclusion. He became almost certain that he had slept in the same sleeping bag that had once belonged to one of the victims. Whether that detail can ever be proven or not, the thought itself stayed with him. It changed the way he looked back on that entire experience. What once felt like a simple, lucky stay with a friendly relative in the bush now carried an entirely different weight in his memory. It's the kind of story that makes you rethink how easily trust is placed when you are traveling. At the time, everything seemed normal. There were no obvious warning signs, no dramatic moments, nothing that would have made anyone suspicious. It was just a kind man offering shelter to young travelers. But later, knowing what he had done, every small detail from that stay takes on a different meaning. The quiet house in the bush, the closet full of sleeping bags, the friendly behavior, the isolation of the location. Things that once seemed ordinary start to feel unsettling in hindsight. And that is what makes the story so disturbing. Not just what happened, but how ordinary it all looked at the time. When I was around 5 years old, something happened to me that I didn't fully understand back then. But as I grew older, I slowly realized how serious it actually was. It was a normal night when I went to sleep, just like any other night in a quiet home. Everything felt ordinary when I closed my eyes. But sometime later, I woke up suddenly to a completely different world inside the house. There was noise everywhere, loud voices coming from different directions, and a strange kind of chaos that I had never experienced before. Bright white lights were flashing through the rooms, moving quickly and unpredictably, as if the entire house had been taken over by confusion. At that age, I couldn't really process what was happening. I only knew something felt wrong. The house no longer felt like a safe and familiar place. It felt tense, unfamiliar, and full of fear that I couldn't fully understand. There were people inside who didn't belong there, and their presence changed everything about the atmosphere of that night. Later on, I learned what had actually happened. A group of robbers had broken into our home shortly after some kind of heist, and we had been caught in the middle of the situation. At the time, I didn't know any of this. All I experienced was the confusion of waking up in a house that suddenly felt like it belonged to strangers instead of my family. What made the situation even more complicated was the language barrier in our home. My family didn't speak English very well at that time, and in the middle of everything, communication became a serious challenge. My parents and grandparents were trying to understand what was going on, but they were struggling to communicate with the people involved and with the police response outside. In that moment, my older sister, who was only around 12 years old, had to step into a role far beyond her age. She became the bridge between everyone, trying to translate and communicate between the robbers, the police, and our family. It was an overwhelming responsibility for someone so young, especially in a situation where everything was happening so fast and under so much pressure. Outside the house, the situation had escalated further. The police had already arrived and surrounded the property. From what I later came to understand, it had turned into a full standoff. Officers were positioned around the house, controlling the situation from the outside while the robbers were still inside with us. The tension in the air must have been extremely high, even though I was too young to fully understand it at the time. Inside the house, everything felt uncertain. There was fear, confusion, and a constant sense of not knowing what would happen next. My family was clearly scared, but at the same time, they were trying their best to stay calm, especially because there were children in the house, including me. In the middle of all that chaos, my grandmother did something that I still remember in a strange way. She gently told me to go back to sleep. I don't know how she managed to think of that in such a moment, but somehow, in the middle of all the noise and tension, I did exactly that. I went back to sleep as if my mind had decided to shut out everything happening around me. Looking back, it feels almost unreal. I was in a house where something very serious was happening. Yet my child's mind couldn't fully process the danger. Instead of fear taking over completely, I simply drifted back into sleep, as if the world outside my bed no longer existed. I don't remember the night in a clear, structured way. It's more like broken fragments. I remember light, noise, movement, and confusion, but not a complete story. And then at some point, everything fades, and I was asleep again. When I woke up the next morning, the house was completely different. It was quiet. There were no flashing lights, no shouting voices, and no visible signs of the chaos from the night before. Everything looked normal on the surface, almost as if nothing had happened at all. For a moment, it felt like it might have been a dream. But that feeling didn't last long because the way my family was acting made it clear that something real and serious had taken place. They were talking among themselves in low voices, trying to process what had happened during the night. As I listened, I slowly began to pick up small details. They were talking about how the situation had unfolded, where people had moved inside the house, and how everything had been handled while I was asleep. At one point, I heard them mention that the robbers had barricaded themselves in the kitchen. There was also something else that I overheard, something that stayed in my memory even though I didn't fully understand it at the time. They mentioned that the kitchen floor had been covered with guns. As a child, I didn't know how to interpret something like that. It didn't immediately feel real or threatening in my understanding. It was just another strange detail from a night that already felt completely confusing. Naturally, I started asking questions because I wanted to understand what had actually happened. But my family didn't really want to explain everything in detail. They believed I was too young to be given the full picture. So whenever I asked, I either got very short answers or was gently told to stop asking. Over time, because I was so young and because nothing directly happened to me in a way I could clearly remember, the memory slowly started to fade. It didn't stay sharp in my mind. Instead, it became something distant, almost like it belonged to someone else's life rather than my own. Years later, I tried asking again, hoping I would finally get a clear explanation of that night. But even then, my family still avoided going into detail. It seemed like something they preferred not to relive or describe too deeply. The memory existed, but it was kept at a distance, even within the family. Now that I am older, when I look back and piece together everything I have heard over the years, the full reality of that night becomes much clearer. I understand that I was a small child sleeping in a house where armed intruders were inside, while police surrounded the building from the outside. I also understand that the situation could have gone in a very different direction. What feels most strange is how incomplete my memory of it is. I don't see it as a full scene in my mind. I only have fragments of sound, light, and confusion. But when I connect those fragments with what I later learned from my family, I can see just how serious and dangerous that night really was. Sometimes I still think about it and wonder how many things I will never fully know about what happened. But even without every detail, the truth is already clear. That night was far more dangerous than I understood as a child, and I was lucky to have come through it without even realizing how close things might have been to turning out very differently. I was around 9 or 10 years old when something happened in my life that I still struggle to fully process even today. It is one of those memories that never really leaves you, even if time tries to soften it. It doesn't stay in your mind as a clear story from beginning to end. Instead, it comes back in fragments, like flashes of images, sounds, and feelings that never quite fit together neatly, but still manage to change the way you see everything around you. It happened during what was supposed to be a happy and ordinary journey. A group of us, 6 people, plus the driver, were traveling together in a van to attend an engagement. It was meant to be a joyful day, full of celebration and family connection. Nobody could have imagined that something so simple and normal would turn into something that would permanently mark everyone involved. The road we were traveling on was long and quiet. It wasn't a busy highway. It was one of those lonely stretches where you can go for miles without seeing much activity. The kind of road where silence settles in naturally, and the movement of the vehicle becomes almost hypnotic. People were likely tired, relaxed, and comfortable, the way you usually feel when you're halfway through a journey, and nothing seems out of place. At some point during the driver became sleepy. It was late enough, or the road was calm enough, that fatigue slowly took over. In situations like that, even a momentary lapse can change everything. And unfortunately, that is exactly what happened. In just a brief moment, the control of the vehicle was lost. The driver suddenly woke up, realizing that something was wrong. The van was no longer moving in a straight and controlled path. It had gone out of his control, and in those few seconds where panic and instinct take over, he made a split-second decision to save himself. He opened his door and jumped out while the vehicle was still moving. From that moment onward, everything unfolded in a way that no one inside could stop or change. The van, now without control, continued moving forward on its own path. It swerved, tilted, and eventually left the stability of the road. What followed was a violent sequence of rolling and tumbling that turned a normal vehicle into something completely destructive in a matter of seconds. Inside the van, there was no way for anyone to react in time. Everything happened too fast. The force of the movement, the sudden loss of control, and the repeated impacts left almost no chance for escape or protection. When it finally came to a stop, the silence that followed was completely different from the calm silence of the road before. It was heavy, broken, and final. Out of the people inside, 4 lost their lives at the scene. 1 person survived with what were described as relatively minor fractures compared to the rest of the tragedy. Another person, however, survived in a condition that no one could have imagined seeing and still recognizing as survival. She had suffered extremely severe injuries across her entire body. Her skull had been fractured. The bones around her eyes were broken and pushed inward, changing the structure of her face. There were injuries to her nose, her jaw, and she lost several teeth. Her shoulder was badly damaged, both fractured and dislocated. Her hip was broken, and multiple bones in her feet were injured, including broken toes. There were also deep injuries to her skin, where parts had been severely damaged due to the impact and movement during the accident. It was the kind of condition that most people would struggle even to comprehend in the moment. and yet she was still alive when help arrived. Somehow, despite everything, she had survived the crash long enough to be taken to the hospital. She was rushed into emergency care immediately. The medical team worked quickly to stabilize her condition and assess the full extent of her injuries. There was no time for delay or hesitation. In situations like this, every minute matters. And the focus is always on keeping the patient alive first before anything else can even be considered. Multiple surgeries were required to address the damage. Her injuries were not limited to one area of the body, which meant different specialists had to work together to manage the situation. There were surgeries for her face, her bones, and other parts of her body that had been affected by the trauma. It was a long and complicated process that required constant medical attention. During her recovery, she was unable to speak for a long time. Her face and jaw had been so severely affected that communication was not immediately possible. She also could not walk for nearly a year. Her body needed time to heal from the multiple fractures and injuries that had taken place all at once. Every small movement required care, patience, and support from the medical team and those around her. When I think back to what I remember from that time, one of the clearest images I still carry is seeing her after surgery. She was completely wrapped in bandages, her entire body covered in medical dressing. It looked as if she had been carefully and completely enclosed, with only small openings left for her eyes and mouth. At that age, I didn't understand the full medical reality of what I was seeing. I only knew that the person I recognized looked completely different and was in a condition I could not make sense of. It was overwhelming in a way that I didn't have the words to express back then. There was a silence around her that felt very different from normal silence. It was the silence of recovery, pain, and survival all existing at the same time. Even as a child, I could sense that what I was seeing was not just injury, but something life-changing. Looking back now, I understand more clearly what she must have gone through. The physical pain, the long surgeries, the slow and difficult recovery process, and the emotional strength it takes to continue after something so extreme. At the time, I only saw the outside of it, but now I can better imagine the internal struggle that must have come with each day of recovery. What stayed with me the most over the years is not just the accident itself, but the realization of how quickly life can change. One moment can divide everything into before and after. A normal journey to a celebration turned into a tragedy that affected multiple families forever. It is something that feels almost unreal when you think about how ordinary everything was at the beginning. Even now, years later, that memory still comes back to me in dreams sometimes. Not in full detail, but in pieces. The van, the road, the silence afterward, and the image of recovery in the hospital. It is not something that fades completely, even with time. As I grew older, I also began to understand something else more deeply. The driver's fatigue, the split-second decision, and the uncontrollable chain of events all played a part in what happened. It was not a single moment of fault, but a series of circumstances that led to something irreversible. Life on the road can change in an instant, and sometimes there is no warning before everything shifts. What remains with me most strongly is the strength of survival. Even after injuries that severe, she lived through it, endured the surgeries, and went through an incredibly long recovery process. She went from a moment where life was almost lost to slowly rebuilding it again over time, step by step. And for me, as a child who witnessed the aftermath, it became one of the earliest moments where I truly understood how fragile life can be. Not in an abstract way, but in a very real and personal sense. It shaped the way I think about safety, about time, and about how quickly everything we take for granted can change without warning. Even today, when I think about that journey, I don't just remember the accident. I remember the idea that a normal day can turn into something unrecognizable in seconds, and that survival itself can sometimes come with a long and difficult road that most people never see from the outside. My mom's best friend still remembers something that happened to her years ago as if it was yesterday. It was late in the evening, and she was driving home after a long and exhausting day at work. Like most people at that hour, all she wanted was to reach home safely, relax, and end her day in peace. The roads were fairly quiet, traffic was light, and nothing around her suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. While she was driving, she noticed flashing lights behind her vehicle. At first, she didn't think much of it. Her first assumption was simple and normal. Maybe she had a broken tail light, or there was some minor issue with her car that she wasn't aware of. So she did what most people would do in that situation. She slowed down, signaled, and pulled over to the side of the road, expecting a routine traffic stop that would be handled quickly and without any stress. A man approached her car window dressed like a police officer. He told her that one of her taillights was not working and asked for her driving documents. She didn't feel any reason to be alarmed at that point. Everything seemed normal and familiar, like a standard interaction that happens on roads every day. She handed over her license and registration without hesitation, still believing this would be over in a few minutes. The officer took her documents and went back to his vehicle. She waited calmly, assuming he was checking her information or preparing a warning. But as the minutes passed, the wait started to feel longer than usual. A small sense of discomfort began to grow, although she still couldn't clearly identify why. Nothing had happened yet that was openly suspicious, but something about the delay didn't feel right. When he returned to her window, the tone of the situation had shifted slightly. He began asking her questions that went beyond a normal traffic stop. At first, they were simple questions about where she was coming from and where she was headed. She answered them without much thought. But slowly, the questions started to change in nature, becoming more personal and unrelated to the reason she had been stopped. He asked about her family, whether she had a husband, whether she had children, and then moved into even more personal territory. He asked about her home, whether there were weapons in it, whether she had daughters, and even questions about pets and general behavior in the household. The direction of the conversation no longer matched a routine police procedure. It started to feel intrusive and uncomfortable, like the questions were being asked for reasons that had nothing to do with traffic safety. At that point, she began to feel uneasy. The situation no longer felt normal. The questions were too personal, too unrelated, and the way they were being asked felt increasingly inappropriate. She gathered her courage and told him directly that she did not feel comfortable answering such personal questions, and that they were not relevant to the traffic stop. Instead of calming the situation, her response caused a sudden change in his behavior. His tone became sharper and more aggressive. The calmness that had been present earlier disappeared completely. He raised his voice and began speaking in a threatening and commanding manner, telling her that he was a police officer and that she needed to shut up and follow instructions. He ordered her to step out of the vehicle in a forceful way that immediately increased her fear. At that moment, her instincts told her that something was seriously wrong. This no longer felt like a standard interaction with law enforcement. It felt unsafe and out of control. She stayed inside her car and instinctively reached for her phone, possibly trying to figure out what to do next or who to call for help. The situation escalated very quickly after that. The man became physically aggressive. He started banging on her window and attempting to open her car door while yelling at her to get out. His behavior was erratic, forceful, and deeply frightening. The sense of authority that had existed at the beginning of the stop no longer made sense. It was being replaced by fear and confusion. In a moment of intense panic, she made a split-second decision. She pressed the accelerator and drove away. It was not something she had planned or thought through carefully. It was a survival reaction, driven purely by fear. All she wanted in that moment was to get away from the situation as quickly as possible and reach somewhere safe. There was a short period where a vehicle followed her, but it did not last long. As she reached a busier main road with more traffic and visibility, the pursuit stopped. Eventually, she was able to put enough distance between herself and the vehicle to feel safe enough to stop. Once she was in a secure place, she immediately called emergency services to report what had happened. It was during that call that she learned something deeply unsettling. There were no police officers assigned to that area at the time of her stop. The person who had pulled her over was not an actual officer. In the days that followed, more details emerged. Authorities discovered that an individual in the area had been impersonating a police officer. He was using the appearance and authority of law enforcement to stop people and manipulate them. It became clear that she had been targeted by someone deliberately using that disguise to gain trust and control. What made the situation even more disturbing was how much personal information he had managed to collect during that short encounter. He had asked specific questions about her family, her home, and her personal life, all of which now seemed intentional rather than random. It was no longer just an uncomfortable conversation. It was a calculated attempt to gather private information. Before the incident ended, she had unknowingly revealed details that could have put her at further risk, including information about her household. Realizing this afterward made the experience even more frightening. What seemed like casual questioning at the time now felt like part of a much more dangerous intention. For a long time after that night, she struggled with fear and anxiety. Everyday situations that once felt normal, like driving alone or seeing police lights on the road, now triggered stress and discomfort. The sense of safety she used to have while traveling alone had been deeply shaken. Out of concern for her own protection, Mushy later made the decision to buy a firearm for self-defense. And it was not something she had ever imagined doing before, but after what she had experienced, she no longer felt comfortable, relying only on assumptions of safety. Eventually, authorities managed to locate and arrest the individual responsible. His arrest brought some relief, but the emotional impact of the incident did not disappear immediately. Even after he was caught, the memory of what happened stayed with her, shaping how she viewed trust, authority, and personal safety. What should have been a simple and routine traffic stop had turned into a deeply disturbing and dangerous experience. For her, it became a moment that changed the way she looked at everyday life, especially situations that are supposed to feel safe and controlled. For those who later heard her story, it served as a reminder that even ordinary situations can sometimes shift in unexpected and dangerous ways, and that awareness and caution can matter even in moments that initially seem completely routine. I used to work in the police force, and there is one case from my time in service that has never left me. Even now, years later, I still think about it from time to time, and I don't believe it is something I will ever completely forget. It started as what seemed like a routine call. we were dispatched to a caravan park after reports that a woman had been screaming from inside one of the caravans. The report itself was already concerning, but what made it more unsettling was the timing. The call had not come in immediately. It had been delayed for several hours, and by the time we were finally sent out, it was already evening. That delay alone made the situation feel heavier, as if something serious might have already been happening for a long time before anyone acted on it. My partner and I arrived at the location together. The caravan park was quiet in that way that makes everything feel more tense than it should. When we reached the specific address, a very large man opened the door. He filled the entire doorway, standing close enough that we couldn't see anything behind him inside the caravan. That immediately put me on alert. In police work, not being able to see inside a location you are about to enter is always something you take seriously. I explained clearly why we were there. I told him we had received reports of a woman screaming from that address and that we needed to check on her well-being. His response was immediate, and it caught my attention. He was calm, almost unusually calm, and even slightly friendly in tone. He explained that there had been an argument between him and his partner, something about an item being stolen from outside the caravan, and he tried to present it as nothing more than a normal domestic disagreement. But something about the way he spoke didn't feel right. It was too controlled, too smooth. It sounded like a story that had already been thought through and repeated in his mind. In situations like that, your instincts start to speak louder than the words being said to you. Even though he appeared cooperative, I knew I couldn't simply leave without checking on the woman inside. Our responsibility was always to make direct contact and ensure safety, especially in domestic-related calls. At first he hesitated, but eventually he stepped aside and allowed us inside. The inside of the caravan was small and dimly lit. That alone made the environment feel more intense. I immediately noticed a woman sitting on the bed. She was fully covered in clothing despite the situation, and she was wearing large sunglasses even though it was nighttime. That detail stood out straight away because it didn't fit the environment or the time of day. I approached her carefully and asked if she was okay. She gave a small nod, but she didn't speak. She avoided eye contact and refused to remove her sunglasses. I remember pausing for a moment because something about her behavior felt off. It wasn't just silence. It felt like hesitation, fear, or possibly instruction not to speak freely. At that point, I didn't have enough evidence to justify an arrest or a forced intervention. There were no visible injuries at that moment, no clear admission, and no direct sign of immediate assault in front of me. So I made a decision to de-escalate the situation. I gave a warning about the disturbance and told them to keep things calm. But as I walked back out of the caravan, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was one of those moments where your training tells you one thing, but your instincts tell you something deeper is hidden underneath. So instead of leaving it there, I decided to speak to the neighbors before clearing the call completely. That decision changed everything. The neighbors told a very different story. They said the woman inside that caravan had been badly beaten. They described hearing disturbances and said she had been suffering for a long time. They also said they were willing to provide statements and support any action taken. The information they gave was enough to shift the entire situation. It was no longer just a noise complaint or a domestic argument. It was now a serious safeguarding concern. With that new information, we returned immediately to the caravan. This time, there was no hesitation in taking control of the situation. The man was arrested on the spot and placed in the back of the patrol vehicle while we secured the scene properly. Once that was done, I went back inside to check on the woman again, this time without him present. What happened next is something I still remember very clearly. As soon as she tried to stand up, she collapsed. It happened so suddenly that we had to step forward immediately to support her and help her back onto the bed. That moment alone confirmed that what we were dealing with was far more serious than what had been visible earlier. Slowly, she began removing the layers of clothing and the sunglasses she had been wearing. What was revealed underneath was far worse than anything we had seen during the initial contact. Her body was covered in bruises from head to toe. Her face was heavily swollen, and both eyes were badly bruised and discolored. There were clear signs that she had been subjected to repeated physical violence over time, not a single incident. As we looked closer, we also saw fresh burn injuries on her legs and abdomen. These were not old injuries. They were recent, suggesting ongoing harm. On top of that, there were multiple puncture wounds across her body, many of them showing signs of infection. The pattern and spread of the injuries made it clear that this was not accidental or isolated. It was sustained abuse over a prolonged period. At that point, the full reality of what had been happening inside that caravan became undeniable. This was not an argument that had gotten out of control. This was a case of someone being trapped in a controlled and violent environment, isolated and unable to escape, suffering repeated harm inside a confined space. What stayed with me most wasn't just the physical injuries. It was the contrast between what I saw at the door and what I later saw inside. At the entrance, the man had been calm, polite, and cooperative. He had presented himself as reasonable and harmless. But behind that surface was someone capable of extreme violence and prolonged cruelty. That contrast is something I have never forgotten. It reinforced something that every officer learns, but few ever fully experience in that way. You cannot judge a situation based on first impressions. Some of the most dangerous individuals appear completely normal when you first meet them. The man was formally arrested and denied bail. The combination of witness statements from neighbors and the evidence we found inside made the case extremely strong. He was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The woman was immediately transferred to medical care. From there, she was placed into a structured recovery program designed specifically for survivors of domestic abuse. For the first time in a long time, she was in a safe environment where she could receive proper support and begin to rebuild her life. Her physical recovery began slowly but steadily. Over time, her condition improved, which was a relief for everyone involved in the case. But what affected me most was something that had nothing to do with physical healing. And even after everything she had gone through, she still spoke about him. She asked if she would ever see him again. She said she still loved him. That moment stayed with me more than anything else, because it showed that the damage in cases like this is not only physical, it is also psychological and emotional in ways that are often difficult to fully understand from the outside. Even after escaping extreme harm, the emotional connection can remain tangled and confusing. That case changed the way I view people and situations forever. It taught me that appearances can be deeply misleading, and that what seems calm and ordinary on the surface can sometimes hide something far more serious underneath. One night, I was leaving Walmart after finishing some shopping. It was already quite late, and the parking lot had that quiet, slightly empty feeling that always comes after the busy hours are gone. A few cars were still parked here and there, and a few people were walking toward their vehicles, but overall, everything felt calm and normal. It was the kind of silence that doesn't feel scary at first, just peaceful in a slightly empty way. I remember the lights in the parking lot were bright, almost too bright compared to how dark everything else felt around the store. My shopping bags were in my hands, and I was just thinking about getting home, relaxing, and ending the day. Nothing about that moment felt unusual. It was just another simple, late-night grocery run like many others before it. As I was walking toward my car, I suddenly noticed someone coming in my direction. At first, I didn't think much of it. People pass by all the time in parking lots. But as he got closer, I realized he was heading straight toward me. That's when I paid more attention. It was a man I had never seen before. A complete stranger. He stopped near me and asked if I could give him a ride. The question caught me off guard immediately. It wasn't something you expect from a random person in a parking lot, especially at that time of night. My first instinct was caution. I've always been careful in situations like this, especially when I'm alone, so I automatically felt uncomfortable. He didn't wait too long before explaining himself. He said he was a truck driver and that he had parked his truck across the highway near a gas station. According to him, he just needed a short ride back so he could continue his work. The way he explained it made it sound simple, almost harmless, like it was just a small inconvenience for him and nothing serious. He spoke in a way that seemed normal at first, almost polite, like he was just asking for help from one stranger to another. But even while he was talking, I noticed I didn't feel fully comfortable. It was hard to explain why. There was no clear reason I could point to, but something inside me felt off about the situation. So I politely refused. I tried to keep my tone respectful so things wouldn't become awkward or tense. I told him I was sorry, but I couldn't give him a ride. I also suggested that he could use a ride service or maybe call someone to help him get back to his truck. For a moment, I thought that would be the end of it. I thought he would understand and just walk away, and I could continue to my car without any issue. But that's not what happened. Almost instantly, his behavior changed. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough for me to notice clearly. His tone became sharper, more direct, and more insistent. He repeated that it was just a ride and kept pushing the idea that I should help him. That shift made me feel even more uncomfortable. It no longer felt like a simple request. It started to feel like pressure. And the more he insisted, the stronger my instinct became that I should leave the situation immediately. There was a strange feeling in that moment that I still remember clearly. It wasn't panic, but it was definitely unease. Something about the way he was behaving made me want distance between us as quickly as possible. So I ended the conversation. I said I had to go, turned away, and started walking toward my car. I didn't want to keep engaging or give the situation any more time than it already had. As I walked away, I could still hear him say something like, "Okay," but I didn't look back to check. I just kept moving forward. My focus was only on reaching my car. Every step toward it felt a bit faster than normal, even though I tried to act calm. I could feel my attention completely locked on getting inside safely and leaving the parking lot. The distance between me and him grew, and with every step, I felt slightly more at ease. When I finally reached my car, I got inside quickly and locked the doors immediately. That small sound of the lock clicking gave me a sense of relief. I sat there for a moment before starting the engine, just making sure everything felt normal again. I left the parking lot without any delay. Even though nothing physical had happened, I still felt a bit shaken. It wasn't fear exactly, but more like a lingering discomfort. My mind kept replaying the interaction. I started wondering if I had been too quick to refuse, or if maybe he truly did need help and I had misunderstood the situation. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore how uncomfortable I had felt when his tone changed. That part stayed in my mind stronger than anything else. I reminded myself of something I had always believed in. I don't give rides to strangers. That night made that rule feel even more important than before. After that, life moved on like normal. Days passed, then weeks, and slowly the memory of that parking lot interaction faded. It became one of those things you remember only when something reminds you of it, not something you think about often. Almost a year later, something unexpected brought it all back in a very sudden way. It was a normal afternoon. I was sitting in a restaurant having lunch, just taking a break and scrolling through my phone. The environment was calm, nothing unusual at all. People were eating, talking quietly, and everything felt like a regular day. While scrolling, I came across a news article that had been shared online. I almost scrolled past it, but something about the image caught my attention. There was a mugshot attached to the article. The moment I saw the face, I froze a little. I recognized him immediately. It was the same man who had approached me in the Walmart parking lot asking for a ride. At first, I just stared at the screen without moving. It felt like my brain needed a moment to connect the memory from that night with what I was seeing now. It almost didn't feel real, like two separate moments trying to overlap. But then I started reading the article, and that's when the feeling shifted completely. According to the report, he wasn't just a random person asking for help. He was wanted in connection with multiple serious murder cases across the state. I remember putting my phone down for a second because I felt overwhelmed. It was too much to process all at once. The idea that I had been standing face to face with someone involved in something like that made everything feel unreal. I picked the phone back up and kept reading, even though it felt uncomfortable. The article explained a disturbing pattern. He would approach strangers in public places and ask for a ride. He would pretend he was stranded or needed help getting back to his truck or another location. Once someone agreed and let him into their vehicle, he would direct them toward isolated areas. After that, he would attack them, take their belongings, and steal their vehicle. Then he would disappear and repeat the same method again with others. Reading that while sitting in a normal restaurant felt completely strange. The noise around me faded into the background for a moment. It was like I wasn't fully present in the room anymore. What affected me the most wasn't just fear. It was the realization of how close the situation had actually been. In that parking lot, nothing had looked clearly dangerous. He didn't appear threatening in an obvious way. He looked like an ordinary person asking for a simple favor in an ordinary place. There was nothing extreme or alarming on the surface that would have made the situation obvious in the moment. That thought stayed with me for a long time. After that day, I kept thinking about how easily things could have gone differently. If I had ignored that uneasy feeling, or tried to be overly polite, or agreed just to avoid awkwardness, the outcome might have been very different. What stayed with me wasn't only the shock of recognizing him later, but also a deeper awareness of how unpredictable situations like that can be. There are rarely clear warning signs in real time. People can look completely normal while hiding dangerous intentions, and you never really know what someone is capable of just by looking at them. That experience changed the way I handle situations like that. I still believe in kindness, and I still believe in helping people when it is safe to do so. But I also learned that instincts matter more than I used to think. That quiet feeling of discomfort, even when there is no clear reason for it, is something worth paying attention to. It also made me realize that setting boundaries is important, even when it feels uncomfortable or awkward in the moment. Being polite should never mean ignoring your own safety or ignoring that inner warning feeling. I don't share this story to make people afraid or suspicious of others. I still believe most people are good. But I do believe awareness is important, and sometimes trusting your instincts can quietly protect you in ways you don't realize at the time. That night outside Walmart seemed like a small, ordinary moment when it happened. But after everything I learned later, it became something I never really forgot. It stayed with me. Not because it was dramatic in the moment, but because of what it meant afterward, and how it quietly changed the way I see the world. My friends and I were out drinking one night, just sitting around talking and laughing the way people do when the conversation slowly starts drifting into old memories. After a while, it turned into one of those casual, remember this person moments, where we began naming people we used to know from school and trying to recall where life had taken them since then. One of the names that came up was a guy we had shared an aid period with back in high school. He was quiet, polite, and honestly completely unremarkable in the most normal way. The kind of student who never caused trouble, never stood out, and just quietly went through school like most people do. At the time, there was absolutely nothing about him that would have made anyone think twice. At first, it was just simple curiosity. I opened my phone and searched his name. I had done this before with other old classmates, and most of the time the results were normal, or nothing at all. Sometimes you find a social media profile, sometimes you find nothing, and the moment passes without much thought. Over time, I had learned that looking up people from the past can feel harmless at first, but it doesn't always stay that way. This time, the results came up quickly, and something about them felt immediately different. Court records started appearing. Appellate documents, case listings, official files. The tone around the table changed without anyone even saying it out loud. What had been light conversation slowly turned into something heavier as we started reading further and trying to understand what we were seeing. From what we could piece together, he had joined the military after high school and was later deployed to Afghanistan. The records described extremely intense combat experiences. The language in the document suggested that what he went through there had a serious psychological impact on him. Something that didn't just fade after returning home, but instead continued affecting him over time. After he came back, things didn't stabilize. According to the information we were reading, he developed severe PTSD along with symptoms consistent with delusional schizophrenia. It wasn't described as a sudden break, but more like a slow and worsening shift in how he experienced reality. As we kept reading, the details became harder to process. The documents described how he became convinced that his mother was not actually herself, but something else entirely. Something he believed was dangerous or controlled by an evil presence. In his mind, he thought he needed to save her, and that belief led him to attempt to kill her multiple times, each attempt being stopped before anything irreversible happened. Reading something like that about someone you once sat next to in a classroom is hard to explain. It doesn't sit properly in your mind. You keep trying to match the quiet, ordinary version of him you remember with the person described in legal documents. And it feels like two completely separate lives that don't belong to the same person. We didn't stop there. Curiosity mixed with disbelief kept us scrolling further. We eventually found his social media accounts, and what we saw there added another layer of discomfort, just in a different way. His posts were long, scattered, and difficult to follow. There wasn't a clear structure or direction to them. Instead, they read like continuous streams of thought, repetitive, emotional, and deeply fragmented. He wrote often about demons, spiritual attacks, hidden forces, and his belief that he was part of a conflict that other people couldn't see. It wasn't just a phase shown in a few posts. It was ongoing, repeated again and again across different entries, like his thoughts never really settled long enough to find calm. The more we read, the heavier the room felt. At some point, nobody was really talking anymore. The laughter and drinking from earlier had completely faded. Everyone was just quietly reading, but not really wanting to continue. It no longer felt like curiosity or casual interest. It felt like something we had stumbled into that carried a weight none of us were prepared for. What made it even harder to accept was how normal he had once seemed. In school, there had been nothing that suggested anything like this. He wasn't disruptive or troubled in any obvious way. He was just there, moving through school life quietly like so many others. Nothing about that version of him matched what we were reading now. After a while, we stopped scrolling and just sat in silence. It wasn't shock in a loud or dramatic sense. It was more like a slow realization settling in, the kind that makes you pause and rethink how unpredictable life can be and how much can change without anyone noticing it happening. Even after that night ended, I kept thinking about it. Not just about him specifically, but about how someone can go from being a quiet, ordinary presence in a classroom to a life completely reshaped by trauma and mental illness. There's no simple way to process something like that or file it neatly in your mind. It felt heavy in a quiet way because there isn't a clean explanation that makes everything make sense. There isn't a clear moment where you can point and say, everything changed right there. It's more like a long, invisible shift that happens outside of anyone's awareness. And at the same time, it left behind a lingering awareness. Not fear exactly, but something more subtle. The awareness that people we once knew casually in the background of our lives can carry stories we never saw and end up on paths we could never have imagined. That night eventually ended like any other night does. Yeah, but the feeling didn't really end with it. It stayed quietly in the back of my mind, changing the way I think about the past and the people who once passed through it without us ever really knowing their full story. A coworker once told me a story that he never really forgot, not because it was loud or dramatic in the way people usually expect, but because of how quickly something completely normal can turn into a life-threatening emergency without any warning at all. He said it happened in his own family. His father was spending the day babysitting his infant grandson. It was one of those ordinary family arrangements that happen everywhere, especially when parents need a bit of help and grandparents are happy to step in. Nothing about that day felt unusual in any way. There was no stress, no sense of danger, and no reason for anyone to think something could go wrong. The house was quiet and comfortable. The baby was in the nursery, and everything seemed peaceful in the way that homes often do when life is simply moving along at a normal pace. The grandfather had done this kind of babysitting before as well, so he was familiar with the routine. He would check on the baby, make sure everything was fine, and move around the house doing small tasks while staying close enough to hear any sound if needed. At one point during the day, he stepped out of the nursery for just a short moment. It wasn't anything planned or important. It was one of those everyday interruptions that happen without thought, like answering a call in another room or grabbing something nearby. The baby was safe, or so it seemed, and there was no reason to expect anything unusual in such a short amount of time. But life often changes in moments that feel too small to matter. When he came back into the nursery, something immediately made him pause. At first, nothing looked wrong. No, the room was exactly as he had left it. There was no noise, no sign of struggle, and no obvious reason to feel concerned. But sometimes, it's not what you see at first glance that matters. It's that small feeling that something is slightly off, even if you can't explain why. As he looked more carefully, his attention shifted toward the baby's crib area. And that's when he noticed something that made his heart drop instantly. The baby had somehow reached the window blinds. In that short time he had been away, the child had managed to grab hold of something that most people in a room would never think twice about. The cord from the blinds had become wrapped around the baby. It was tight enough that the situation was already dangerous. The baby was struggling to breathe, and there was no confusion about what was happening. It was one of those moments where everything becomes clear in an instant, and that clarity brings pure panic with it. There was no gradual warning, no slow build-up that allows the mind to adjust. It went from a quiet, normal room to an emergency in seconds. The kind of situation where your body reacts before your thoughts can fully catch up. The grandfather rushed forward immediately. There was no time to think through steps or stay calm in a controlled way. Instinct took over completely. His focus narrowed to one thing only: getting the baby free and safe as quickly as possible. At the same time, he reached for emergency help. Even while trying to act physically, he understood that this was not something he could handle alone, and that professional help needed to be on the way as fast as possible. Every second mattered, and that knowledge added a heavy pressure to everything he was doing. The baby's condition was already worsening. His skin tone had started to change, which is one of the clearest signs that oxygen is not reaching the body properly. That detail alone made the situation feel even more terrifying. It wasn't just dangerous anymore, it was critical. Time, in moments like that, feels strange. It doesn't move in a normal way. A few seconds feel stretched out like minutes, and every small delay feels much bigger than it actually is. The grandfather was trying to manage multiple things at once, helping the baby while staying on the phone, explaining the situation, and trying not to lose control emotionally, even though everything inside him must have been in panic. He kept working urgently to free the baby, doing whatever he could in that moment, even though nothing about it felt easy or simple. Situations like this don't allow for calm planning. They only allow action, fast and desperate. On the other end of the phone, emergency responders were already treating it as urgent. Instructions were given, but more importantly, help was already being dispatched. Those few minutes while waiting must have felt unbearable. The kind of minutes where you are constantly aware that every passing second could matter. Then, finally, help arrived. Emergency medical responders reached the home within minutes. The speed itself was critical. They didn't waste time with questions or hesitation. As soon as they entered, their focus shifted entirely to the baby and the situation at hand. Everything they did was fast, practiced, and precise. In emergencies like this, there is no room for delay or confusion. They worked immediately to restore breathing and stabilize the child, taking over the situation in a way that only trained professionals can. And then, after what must have felt like an eternity for the family, there was a turning point. The baby survived. That moment changed everything in the room. What had been a situation on the edge of disaster slowly began to shift toward safety. It wasn't instant relief because even after the immediate danger passes, there is still fear and uncertainty lingering in the air. But the most critical outcome had been achieved. The baby was then taken to the hospital for further care and observation. In cases like this, even when things seem to improve quickly, medical monitoring is still very important. Doctors needed to make sure there were no hidden complications or lasting effects from what had happened. For the family, those hours afterward were filled with a different kind of tension. The emergency itself was over, but the emotional weight remained. It is hard to fully relax after something like that, even when you are told things are stable. There's a kind of quiet shock that settles in after intense fear. As part of the process, a full investigation was carried out, which is standard in any serious medical emergency involving a child. Authorities needed to understand exactly how the situation had happened. They asked questions, reviewed details, and carefully examined the environment to make sure everything was clear. At first, this kind of process can feel overwhelming for families because it involves careful scrutiny of every detail. But it is done to rule out any possibility of neglect or harm. In this case, as the investigation continued, it became clear that what had happened was not intentional and not the result of negligence in a harmful sense. It was a tragic accident. A chain of ordinary, everyday circumstances had come together in the worst possible way. Something as simple as window blind cords, which exist in many homes without much thought, had become part of a dangerous situation that no one had expected. Eventually, the case was closed and the family was cleared. The focus shifted away from investigation and back toward recovery and healing. The most important part of the story came after that. The baby recovered fully. There were no lasting complications, and over time, life returned to normal. The child grew up healthy, and what had once been a terrifying emergency slowly turned into a memory that the family carried with them. Not something they talked about often, but something they never forgot either. As my co-worker shared this story, he explained that what stayed with him most was not just the fear of what happened, but how quickly it happened. One moment, everything was completely normal, and within seconds, everything had changed. It is difficult to fully understand that kind of shift until you hear it from someone who lived through it. It also makes you think differently about everyday life. How many things around us feel completely harmless until a situation shows otherwise. How easily routine moments can hide unexpected risks, especially when it comes to infants who explore everything without understanding danger. But more than anything, what stands out in this story is the response. The grandfather noticing something was wrong in time, reacting immediately instead of hesitating, and the emergency team arriving quickly enough to change the outcome. Each part played a role in how the situation ended. In a different version of events, even a small delay could have changed everything. But in this case, awareness and fast action made the difference between tragedy and survival. And that is why this story stayed with him for so long, and why it stays with anyone who hears it. It is a reminder of how fragile, ordinary moments can be, and how important quick response becomes when everything suddenly changes without warning.